Hello, I'm Gary from Consultants Like Us, a cybersecurity and information governance, risk and compliance consultancy, and I'm going to be chairing this particular video. I'm joined by the co-founder of iComply, and iComply with Consultants Like Us have come together to help implement compliance without complexity. Now, in this series of videos, we're talking about the FTC Safeguards Rule in quite a lot of detail. There are many topics that we've already covered and have yet to cover. But we formed this partnership to help organizations understand security in its broadest sense, but then really focus in on the FTC Safeguards Rule. So without further ado, hi, Lou, how are you doing?
Amazing. It's been an interesting day, but it's never a dull day in cybersecurity. I
This
will
is
be
it.
able to hopefully I'll be able to elaborate on this in due course.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, as you say, it's never a dull day, is it? So,
No.
on this particular episode, we are covering a very key topic. It's all around a qualified individual. Now, before
Yeah.
we before we get into it, I'll state exactly what it says within the FTC Safeguards Rule, and then we will just talk about that particular role. So this is what it states, and correct me if I'm wrong in any places here. So I'm going to read this verbatim. The rule states that in order to develop, implement, and maintain your information security program, an organization shall designate a qualified individual responsible for overseeing and implementing your information security program and enforcing your information security program. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, the qualified individual may be employed by you or could be an affiliate or a service provider. Now, I'm going to leave it there and I'm just going to dive straight in, Luke. So, what do you think a qualified individual is in this context?
Uh, well, I mean, let's just look at what the rule says in a couple of things. So we're talking about information security program. Um, Now, if I was to talk about qualified, I would argue a qualified individual would look like a chief information security officer or a chief security officer or an information security manager, someone who has either knowledge and or background and or education in that particular domain. Now that would stand to reason. That's what qualified looks like in the context of running an information security program. There's a big but here because I don't think FTC sees it like that. Because I can actually pull out another piece of verbiage that they've got around what they determine a qualified individual to look like.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah. So in their words on the FTC's, they've got business guidance.
Mm.
Designate a qualified individual to implement and supervise your company's information security program. The qualified individual can be an employee of your company or work for an affiliate, like you've pointed out. What matters is real world know how suited to your circumstances. The qualified individual selected may have a different background from someone running a large corporate or complex system. It goes on to effectively reiterate what you've actually said, but I think the key point here is says what matters is real world know how suited to your circumstances.
Mm.
Now, if we go
Uh,
back to qualified, and
yeah.
it's easy. I always like to look at the comparisons because FTC safeguards, as we've talked about, applies to a very big range of organizations.
Uh,
You are going to have a single seat organization and
yep.
you have 1,000 seat organization.
Yep.
Qualified will differ. If you've got to run an information security program, I find this a really difficult question to answer about
Mm.
what qualified should look like for a firm. I just know that if
Yeah.
it was me, I would want to have my knowledge and my experience and my background to be able to adhere to something like this.
I think do you know what? Honestly, it is such an interesting thing, and anyone who's watched any of the other videos will know that we do focus in on and really laser in on some key words here. But the phrase there is that real world know-how, isn't it? So what qualifies you? Well, does it mean you've got to have a degree? It doesn't say that, does it?
No.
I would argue that real world experience, you've gone, I don't know about you, Luke, but I went to the University of Life,
Yeah.
School of Hard Knocks,
Yeah.
and I'm battle hardened through, the storms that we've weathered. So that's what qualifies me to be or I think is a qualified individual, because I wear the scars. I've gone into battle and such and come out of them victorious. But
So I think the
if you qualified, so a qualified individual, does that need to be someone who has got CISOs, has got the fellowship kind of credentials?
I think we need to come at this from a couple of different angles. So the FTC Safeguards Rule is a legal requirement.
Mm,
We know that to piece of legislation, you have to adhere to it if you fall under it. So that's the first thing.
yeah.
The second thing, and you said it, shall. Shall, that word in law is either mandatory or must.
Mm,
So by law, you must do something. And that must be, you must have a qualified individual. Now, if you come at it from the other angle and say, I'm a customer, I work with this tax firm, I'm storing all my data with you. Am I going to have anything else other than high expectations that you're going to keep my data safe because you're adhering to the law? I look at it from a customer standpoint and say, I want you to know what the FTC Safeguards Rule means inside and out for your firm. I would like you to have a really good understanding around the type of technical controls that need to be implemented to protect my data.
mm.
It's just, I think it really depends on the angle you're coming at. The FTC safeguards seems to be more lax about it than what arguably you or I and even a customer might be.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, but I think the very fact that it's called out as almost the first requirement, you've got to
Yeah.
have a qualified individual. I think that's a better way of describing it in some respects than many other frameworks. And dare I say, even ISO 27001,
Mm.
it talks about roles and responsibilities and accountability and such, which are, again, honing in on keywords. It's like, what do you mean accountable? What it's debatable. Um, but I think it's really important for me, and I'm going to avoid getting too much onto my soapbox here, because I could get onto my grumpy soapbox, and that is that all too often, in my personal experience, Luke, I'll be interested in yours, is that when someone tries to implement an information security program of any shape or size, often it's given to that individual who's just good at Excel or just quite good at project management and such. And I think what I really like about the FTC Safeguards Rule is this phrase about real world know-how. I think that really tells it. When I go and audit someone, I'm going to say who's managing your information security program. And if it's some project manager, with the greatest of respect, I want to dig deep into their competencies, their skills, their experience. I'm not looking for a degree. I'm looking for real world know-how. So I really like the way that the FTC Safeguard Rule sort of just picks out that phrase. I think that's what I will be using in other frameworks.
I think if we look at it again, look at it different business demographics, if we want to call it that. Um, Real world know-how is going to really be centered around you're going to know the business inside and out. You're going to operationally understand what the objectives are, the revenue, some of the risks, um, where potentially some of the problems are. You've probably got a little bit of a control around the strategy of the business. There's some of the things that you would expect as a security leader to have some grasp of. So if you look at it just from an operational standpoint, invariably it'll probably be a firm owner or someone senior in the organization. They probably have a lot of information straight off the bat. My
Mm.
question would be is if the worst happens and you have a security breach, how much of that gets called into question about were you actually competent in the delivery of that role? Who actually assesses that competency?
Mm. No, I completely agree. And again, it's a multifaceted role. Information security is, if we look at it in its broadest sense, again, you've just said it there, incident response. Incident responders, incident response, business continuity is a discipline all of its own. there's an ISO standard for it, ISO 22301. If we're talking about auditing, you've got to audit, monitor and measuring, which I know we're going to come on to another time. But someone's got to do that, and someone's got to know how, again, words, the know-how, to audit independently and have a good understanding of auditing. Auditing is a profession. Risk management is a profession. You just said it there, whoever is going to be taking this role on, they've got to have strategic, tactical and operational viewpoints and be able to stand back and look at all of these things and know how to do that in a real world context as it applies to that particular organization, if it's a 1-seat business through to 1,000 seat. So it's a very far-reaching role, and I think it's pivotal.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I'm going to just come again, just give some context. Look, we've both been chief security officers, or are chief security officers. In the US now, we've had a number of major organizations in the US that have had a security incident or a data breach. There have been some occasions where either the law enforcement agency has called out specifically the security officer, making them culpable and accountable for the security program, and also where organizations have actually washed their hands of that individual, saying that person's responsible. They're the ones who should really be answering the hard questions here. So you've got CISOs being front and center, saying they're getting called out for running the security program and any deficiencies. Insurance companies now are providing CISO-specific insurance to protect you specifically from civil liability, which means that it's not just you're sitting under the business umbrella for public liability, civil liability for insurance. You have to have your own to protect yourself, which I find absolutely staggering.
Yeah.
That you've got someone who's so accountable that it's not, the security is a shared responsibility at the end of the day. I think everybody plays a part, but just simply calling out an individual saying unless you're outright negligent, yeah, maybe, but how often is that going to happen? And that's why I think let's go back to how does that actually apply to a firm owner who then has a data breach? Just think about the civil liabilities that they could be exposed to if they have a data breach.
Yeah. Yeah, it is staggering. Like you say, I think when people step into that role, so as we often do with these videos, we like to give people practical things to think about. I would say if someone is coming towards you with we've got a stretch opportunity for you. We've got a new project because you're just the person for this role. I would be looking very carefully at what that role is and what does that mean. And as you said, in the US especially, should be looking at personal insurance.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, insurance is a topic we'll come on to at some point because there's so many gotchas with insurance that firms need to be aware of, and
absolutely
how that actually applies to the business. Yeah, look, I find this, if I'm being honest, I think this is probably the thing that probably aggravates me the most about the FTC Safeguards Rule, because there's so much accountability on that very first point, designated qualified individual. And like, I agree, real world know-how is a great term, but again, so much vagueness around what makes that person competent. How do you actually assess that competency? But if you look in practical terms, having a really good understanding about the business is fundamental. I don't think anybody can dispute that. At a bare minimum, having an understanding around the FTC Safeguards Rule. What are all of the requirements? What all are the requirements that are specific and relevant to your firm, and why? I think those are probably the very starting points. Anything less than that is bordering on to either ignorance or negligence, or you're just unfortunate.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's not within this part of the conversation, but when we go in and we talk to people about and assess them about their information security, and we talk about competency and skills and experience and know-how and knowledge and such, one of the other questions I like to ask is, how much time have you got for this role? Because it's a resource issue, right? It's a big undertaking. And again, often, and again, I'm going to stay off the soapbox too much here, but it's often just the busiest person who always seems to get things done. They give it to them, and suddenly this person has just another job to do on top of everything else that they've been given. Does that qualify them to be the right person?
Yeah, I just see it as a de facto role, is that you're just
Mm,
lumping another hat on somebody else to wear inside the organization. And we talked about it in a couple of other webinars we've had before, where it is potentially going to be either the chief financial officer or the firm owner or somebody, like you say, who knows a little bit about Excel, who's going to probably just wear that hat for a little bit. I think it's a really valid point you've raised there about how much time have you got to commit to, one, implementing the program, and two, maintaining that program. So you
mm.
actually demonstrating the requirement about continuous improvement and it's updated on a regular basis.
Yeah. I mean, you've hit on a question I was going to ask actually, because it was linked to something you said earlier, which is so the question I got really was just, is there already a role within the organization that this would naturally sit within? Is it as natural as, oh, well, you're the CISO, this naturally fits within your world? Would you say that that is where we are if an organization is lucky enough to have a chief information security officer?
Look, I think for the most part, let's just focus on the 1 to 10 seat organizations. I would suggest it'll probably be either a firm owner or one of the more senior people that will probably undertake that role, simply because they're more strategic in nature. They know how to set objectives. They've got the relationships. So they've got actually the power to control and influence certain things in the business. I would simply say, I mean, Lee mentioned it in our last webinar. He says it's not uncommon for it doesn't have to be a tax or an accounting firm. It could be any business to find that the finance department is running the information security program.
Mm,
I'm not saying there's any particular thing right or wrong about that. I do think there's a lot of parallels between, people who are in the financial sector and cybersecurity. You've got the analytical skills. You do the risk assessment. You're good with
good with
numbers.
Excel.
Yeah, yeah, you'd hope so. And so yeah, I can see the reasons why finance or even a CFO might even run a program.
Mm,
Let's just to be clear. I mean, in a role I currently have now, and in the previous part, I've reported into the CFO, and it works brilliantly.
mm,
Um, so
yeah.
I would,
It,
yeah, I wouldn't say there's a specific role. Again, it really depends on the makeup of the business in terms of size, and again, revenue might actually influence that. Because I think, again, just from the information I've been getting from different firms, is upwards to around about £500,000. You might be 2, 3, 4 seat organization. When you get 500 to a million, you are approaching the 10 seat organization. At that
mm,
point, that becomes, the risk starts to increase quite a lot at that point,
yeah.
because you've got more staff, probably more suppliers, you've probably got more data, which I think invariably you're going to have more risk as a result of that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And interesting what you said there about you reporting into the CFO. So when I look back to times when I've been working for corporations and large and small businesses, I think I can state with some certain level of certainty the only function I haven't reported into is the marketing team. I've reported into the CFO, I've reported into the CTO, I've reported into operations, even reported into the sales team, which is a bit weird, but it was good because again, that was a good engagement actually, because the sales team were very actively involved in how can we
Mm,
promote the fact that we've got these security credentials.
yeah.
What can we do? How, and it was like almost, often joke that I was wheeled out like Hannibal Lecter, onto stage, plonked there. Gary, talk. This is our security guy. Talk, and then I would talk for a little while about security, and then they go, right, thank you, and then wheel me back off again, like Hannibal Lecter. But yeah, interesting that you mentioned that you've reported into the CFO, because I think of all the times that I've done this role, reporting to CFO, CRO, which is the chief risk officer, because I know in some quarters that's known as the chief revenue officer, but not
That's
that,
right. Yeah.
CRO, chief risk officer. So those sorts of roles where they have an overarching discipline. I think they tend to be the ones where it's most successful. The IT, funnily enough, when I've reported into IT, that's been where we've had most difficulty. And that's again because of that old stereotype of, it's information security, that's an IT problem. That's IT's job. And it's like, it's not. And they're like, well, you're from IT, right? You go, well, yes, I am. Well, it's an IT problem. Then you're like, no, that's not right. Stop it.
Yeah, again, I think look at finance. Finance operate in data at the end of the day,
Yeah.
and you argue say they're probably more equipped than the IT. Yes, the IT guys might know more about the technology, but there's a big difference between running a program, running a risk assessment, understanding strategically what the business needs versus configuring a firewall. Vastly different skill sets.
Well, that's a really interesting point. So, qualified individual, do they have to have a technology background? Do they have to have knowledge of, you're already shaking your head. So, short answer, no. Okay, fine. Let's move on.
No, I don't think so. Look, I think it's not necessarily a technology background. I think you've got to have an understanding at a base level around what is a firewall's purpose
Yeah.
and what does a VPN do and why is that important? Do you know how to, do you actually know how to deploy and configure a firewall, whether it be an on-premises or a cloud-based solution? I don't think so. Understanding, what its purpose is, how it works, is it working? How do you know it's working? Those are probably the things. I mean, you can argue the point that, even some CISOs today, you don't need to be technical. There's a lot of debate around that, which we could quite comfortably go into. I
Mm,
don't think so. I don't think you need a technology background personally. I think just having a good understanding around your suppliers, your risk, the business, um, data management. I think those are really some of the core things at the bare minimum you
mm,
should be have as a qualified individual.
yeah. I think that, yeah, I would completely agree. But as you and I both know, that online, it's often a debated conversation, isn't it? It's like, that CTOs, not CTOs, CISOs need to be from a technical background or have a deep understanding of technology. And it's like,
Hmm.
I kind of understand what you're saying, but I'm more in your camp, which is they should have a broad understanding of the disciplines and the various technologies involved. But if you gave me a firewall and said, right, go away and configure this, set it up on a network, I'd be like, okay, I get the principles and but yes, it's better to be left to professionals who are better equipped than I am. Although it would be down to me as the CISO to define what the strategy is and where are the most important places to look at defending ourselves from what quarter, where are we most vulnerable, because I'll have a broader understanding of the risk landscape.
Yeah. So let's look at it in real terms. And what's the easiest way to get around those hurdles very early on? I think outsourcing is one of the quickest way you can do it. If you've
Mm,
got a deficiency and you don't know if you need a firewall or not, or you don't know how to implement multi-factor or if it's even relevant, you can outsource it very quickly, do that gap analysis, get the answer that you need and do something with it or don't do something. Just use the answer from someone like an expert. Once you've actually got that information, you're getting a little bit more control
mm,
over what it is you need to do to run an information security program. I think there's so much information that's out there. I love the use of Google and Gemini and ChatGPT, which are great, but you can't really escape the know-how of a security expert to say this is what you need and this is the reasons why you need it.
yeah. Because and again, this almost circles back to something we said earlier, which is about this, having that strategic view of your business and a deep understanding. Because there's legislative issues, that with the greatest of respect, the CTO is not going to sit down and read the FTC Safeguards Rule because 90% of it doesn't apply to them, or they won't see it how it applies to them. So you need someone who's going to look at the internal issues, the external issues. Someone's going to look at the regulatory perspectives, and as you say, have that technical know-how and be able to talk to this technical team as well as they can speak to the data protection officers or the compliance people or the risk or the finance teams. So it's a very broad church. So you just hit on something actually, which I'm going to come back to what you said earlier, which is about the challenge, some of the challenges that these guys, the qualified individuals, if you don't have those skills, that knowledge, go out and get it from somewhere. What challenges do you think a qualified individual is likely to have?
I think there's a number. So I'm going to talk about the WISP very quickly. So the IRS were one of the first organizations or bodies to release a WISP template. It has some of the core requirements in it. What has followed then is we have a lot of major SaaS companies in the accounting space that have also created their version of a WISP. Now, I'm just going to say it. If from what I've seen, whether you use the IRS WISP or a WISP from a major provider, I do not think that that's going to help you a great deal because they are checklists for the most part. They're simply saying, have you got a firewall? Check. Have you got multi-factor authentication? Check. That's not a security program. That is a checklist. It's a technical checklist. That doesn't tell you anything around about how you run an information security program.
No.
So I think one of the challenges will be if you're acting as the qualified individual and you're using that as the basis to run your program, you're going to run yourself into a hole very quickly. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges around about where you get the right information from. If you've got major SaaS providers saying this is what you need to do to be compliant and nobody's challenging that, that's a challenge that they don't even know they're even being presented with. So I think that's one of the first things.
Wow. Yeah. No, I completely agree. It's that um, you just don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, that's
Which
it. That's right.
and this is no insult to people who, if you don't know, if like you said, if you've got a major provider who's come to you and said, look, this is a WISP, just use this and you'll be fine, then and if you're already busy enough, you've got a lot to do, so you're just going to go, right, well, they said this, I'm going to take that and I'm going to apply it, and we're golden, and just fingers crossed we don't have a major issue, because when we do, that's the bit where you're going to find yourself in hot water, because as you said, that's not a program, at best it's a gap analysis, isn't it? It's
Yeah, absolutely.
kind of,
That's it. Yeah.
so it's a good place to start. Maybe I've not seen all these WISPs, and I know you've seen a lot more than I have, but the ones I've seen, I would agree with you, they're just about, I would describe them as a gap analysis, and a gap analysis is only as good as, if you're going to take the output from it and actually go and close the gaps.
Do something with it.
You've got to do something with it. Yeah. Do you have an incident response plan? No. Well, guess what your first action is going to be? So
So last week we sort of touched on it. I'm looking through my list of things here about some comments that were made not so long ago from a major provider around about running an information security program, and this is the reasons why I want to go. That information is a challenge for firms about what is actually right to run an information security program. And I'm a little honestly, I'm stuck here about which is my favorite. A culture of security is built from the top down. You could argue that that's probably right for the most part. That's probably right. The thing I find funny, firms see security as the biggest blocker to growing their firm. Firms see security as the biggest blocker to growing the firm. At what point has a tax firm ever said that security is the thing that's actually stopping me from scaling, getting more revenue, growing into other areas? I'd love to hear anyone come forward with an actual reasonable example where that's actually the case. That's come from one of the major SaaS providers. And
but what's the point in saying that? I mean, I have heard similar things being said, that security is an inhibitor, that it's just bureaucracy. The minute you start saying, well, we've got to have a change control process, if we're going to implement something, we've got to have a change control process. These smaller organizations will argue and say, well, hang on a minute, I didn't have to fill in a form before. I didn't need to do a risk assessment. I could just make a change and then just bang it out live and see what happens. So once you start implementing these controls, that's the part I think where organizations will say, well, it's an inhibitor, it slows us down. Regulation, is slowing us down. It's like, well, sometimes you have to, there's the brakes on a car for a reason, right?
Yes. Yeah, well, that's the thing. Security's always seen what's security's role. You think, well, it's just A, B, and C, and and the brakes analogy is utterly brilliant because you think, well, you say, well, securities are like the brakes on a car, and everyone gravitates to saying, of course, you slow things down, but it's actually not. And if you think what's one of the most important things on a race car, it is your brakes because they help you enter a corner faster, accelerate out, maneuver. If you haven't got brakes, you have not got the ability to control a vehicle at speed.
And dare I say it, finish the race alive.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And you're
Don't kill
talking to someone
yourself
who
or
was
anyone else in the process, right? So
yeah, well,
yeah,
you're talking to someone who was an advanced driver in the police, and so I can tell you right now that the brakes are very important. They allow me to do things in a vehicle that I otherwise would not be able to have achieved.
yeah.
So I think the brakes are not the things that slow you down. They
So
allow
yeah,
you go speed control.
that's it. Control is the key word, isn't it? And it's, the phrase I often use when organizations say, well, why do I have to do that? I didn't do it before. And I'm quite blunt
No.
about these things. I like to think I put it across with a smile, but I'm quite blunt. And I will often say to them, this is life in long trousers, meaning it's time to grow up. You can't just simply make a change and throw it out there and see what happens. Those days are gone. We need to have a controlled method of implementing change or doing something, whether it be software development life cycle that you introduce a risk assessment before its final release or whichever way you're going to do it. But this is life in long trousers, everybody. This is time to grow up and do it properly. And it doesn't mean it has to be overly bureaucratic. It can be, a very simple process. It's just getting people to slow down before you go into the corner, before you go faster, and just say, have we spotted all the blind spots? Have we identified any issues before we actually hit the accelerator and go and send this out to the world?
Yeah,
Keeping on with the car metaphor.
that's it. God forbid you actually release a piece of software out into the wide world without actually testing it first.
Yeah,
That's
never
exactly
happens, right? That never
yeah,
happens.
right, yeah, yeah. So look, I just that's just going back to it. I think the amount of information that's accurate out there at the moment is one of the challenges for firms because I don't think they've been given the right information either from, I'm going to say, not the right information from the FTC, enough information from the FTC. I don't think there is enough information from the IRS. Yeah, there's a lot of helpful stuff out there, but you got to sort out what's actually the stuff you want to listen to and what you don't. I think the competency area as well. I don't think there's actually enough training for qualified individuals to actually know, well, how do I actually run a risk assessment? What's the difference between a business impact assessment for business continuity versus a risk assessment? What's the difference between and why? What does an incident response plan need to consist of? Yes, you can follow the checklist and that's absolutely fine, but you might want to know a little bit more detail around roles and responsibilities. What are your reporting requirements? What's the threshold of what you need to report? So I think training is another element where I'm just really surprised we've got such a sweeping piece of legislation which has been saying you need to adhere to it. Someone's going to have to do it, but they don't give you the tools to do it properly.
No, I completely agree. And I think that final point you made there about the training, I think that's the bit where it circles right back to the beginning. What qualifies an individual? Well, it's someone who's had that rounded knowledge, experience, training, education, whatever you want to call it. But it's being provided by, dare I say it, consultants like us, I Comply, people who have done this kind of role, whether it be, I was the crisis management leader for a large bank, European crisis management leader. So I have a deep knowledge of crisis management, incident response, good broad understanding of risk management and various other things. I'm not going to go into all the various credentials. And likewise with your good self, Luke, you've got oodles of experience and knowledge in all the various disciplines and different areas. My concern is that people and challenge, I think, to answer my own question, the challenge I think that qualified individuals have got is that they're listening to their IT providers or one particular person and saying, that's all I need to do. And they're not looking at the broad church of information security, governance, risk and compliance, crisis management, business continuity, the stuff that you and I do day in and day out.
Yeah. So just on that point there, then, so when you talk about you listening to your IT provider, who in that IT provider are they going to be listening to? Are they going to be listening to the people doing the IT, the people who are typically, squirreling away, doing their actual job, doing their job diligently, or the people in sales and marketing, the people who are the voice of that organization giving that information? It's not going to be the IT guy. You're going to be listening to someone in sales and marketing saying, this is what you need to do to be compliant. This is what you need to do to be secure. When invariably they're probably just going to, and I'm not going to say, look, I'm not going to say everyone's, not going to know a little bit about security, but just go and chat GPT and Google it because they're always right. It's not, you get to pull information which is potentially wrong. And so I think, again, you're listening to potentially people who are not qualified to be giving that information and that advice, guidance in the first place.
Yeah. And I think that neatly sort of brings us full circle again back to the beginning where we talk about the qualified individual needing the know-how, the real world know-how. I think that, like I say, for me, that one phrase really encapsulates what the qualified individual needs to have.
Yeah.
What that looks like for you, as it relates to your organization, your scope, etc., is down to interpretation. But having that real world know-how and asking you, if you are watching this and if you are and have been identified as the qualified individual, I would ask you to sit and do a little bit of self-reflection and say, what real world know-how do I have? And if you don't know, if you feel you're lacking in any way in that, speak to Luke. I comply. Speak to myself, Gary, at Consultants Like Us, and we will point you in the right direction. But don't just sit and look at that woefully inadequate. I'm going to say it, woefully inadequate WISPs that we're seeing. These checkbox things. They're not a WISP. They're not a program, as you said. They're a gap analysis at best.
At best.
So with that, I think we've given enough food for thought for people who are either already qualified individuals or someone has come and put a, dare I say, a poison chalice on their desks. It's not. It's a great opportunity. It's a stretch opportunity, as we used to call it in the bank, which when if any manager ever came to you and said, I've got a stretch opportunity, you'd be thinking, yeah, this is going to stretch me right out of the door. This, I don't want this. But anyway, but I think we've given plenty of food for thought on this. Now, so with that, I don't know, Luke, if you've got any closing thoughts around this, any bit sort of words of wisdom before we close, and then we talk about what we're going to talk about next time.
So look, if I was going to say to anyone who's in a position where in that role, I think the first thing is just get the FTC Safeguards website up in front of you and just read through what the list of requirements are. Just get your head around what is it I actually need to do to be compliant, and what of those requirements are actually relevant for me. From that, what do you know and what don't you know? What are the things that are in your wheelhouse or within your scope of capability to deal with yourself, or where do I actually need to outsource it to somebody else or consult with somebody else to actually do those bits for you? A lot of the tax accounting firms now have gone to like a cloud first process or solution. Some of the solutions may very well be actually ticking the boxes, so to speak, in helping you be compliant straight away through things like MFA and encryption and backups and continuous monitoring and so on. They might already be doing it, and so you already have those under control through your provider. Those are just very much the light touch things. Risk assessment for me is just that one thing, is just saying, what is it you need to protect? Why do you need to protect it? How are you going to protect it? They're just the very starting points, just at least get you moving, and then things should start to fall into place when you start asking more questions and documentation on what it is you're actually doing. I think that's it's a starter for 10.
Yeah, no, perfect, brilliant. I mean, well, funnily enough, that's where we're going to leave it. And you neatly actually introduce our next topic for next time, because on the next FTC Safeguards Rule webinar that we're going to run, I would like us to discuss in detail risk management. The regulation itself, again, to quote it verbatim, requires you as an organization to base your information security program on a risk assessment that identifies reasonably foreseeable internal and external risks to the security, confidentiality, and integrity of customer information that could result in the unauthorized disclosure, misuse, alteration, destruction, or otherwise compromise of such information, and assesses the sufficiency of any safeguards in place to control these risks. That's all one sentence, by the way. When do regulators do away with full stops? That's all I'm going to ask. Okay, but that's another topic. But yeah, so next time we're going to talk about risk assessments in more detail. But Luke, great talking to you as ever. Really enjoyed that. Yeah, I'm pushing my soapbox firmly away for the evening, and we'll get it out again next week when we start talking about risk assessments. But thanks everyone for watching and or listening. And don't forget to like, comment, and share, because you don't know who you could be helping. But until next time, stay well, stay safe, and stay connected. Thanks a lot. Speak to you next time. Cheers.
Cheers.